All right, hello, hello. We're back again for another Other Ink Thursday, and as he has promised to do a few times this year, Tristan Zimmerman is back with me to talk about some Molten Sulfur stuff. Hey, Tristan.
Hi, Matt. Delighted to be here.
It truly is a delight. We've already been having a delightful conversation, but it is time to press on and talk about
Yeah.
your blog posts. And again, for those who maybe this is your first video, Tristan runs I'll introduce Tristan here with a little brief thing that he runs a blog called moltensulfur.com. And it is history tidbits, legends, myths, actual history, biographies, and they're all gameable. Put these NPCs in your game, put these cities into your game, put these weird political entanglements in your game immediately. Like it's a great blog, deep well of back. What do you describe it as a modest paywall? What is you
Yeah. I think a
reasonable
very
paywall?
reasonable paywall of
Uh,
of
it,
two
it,
dollars a month. If you want, I want to say I'm up to 350 blog posts or something like that.
all right, one for
Um,
every day of the year,
yeah.
almost.
Um, but the most recent 50 are always free. And yeah, I focus on sharing stuff from real history and folklore that's like cool and worth learning about in its own right. And then it's, hey, how can you file the serial numbers off of this and drop it into the campaign that you are already running?
Right. So, what are some recent highlights from the blog that you would like to talk about today?
Well, one that I'm real excited to talk about is the Wandering Lake of Lop Nor.
Yeah, I specifically requested this one because I also really enjoyed this learning about this one.
Yeah, I stumbled across it in like a throwaway line in a book about some cool mummies. I was like, wait. Wandering Lake. Like lakes don't do that. And so I dug into it some more, and it's just this really amazing story. So um this lake Lop Nor is or was in Xinjiang in the deserts of Western China. Um, and this desert is it's a cold desert, right? It's right next to the Gobi Desert. That will mean something to some people, especially if they were dinosaur kids. Um, and so it's hot in the summer, but like it is terribly cold in the winter. And
Uh, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of I've spent some time in Arizona, so it's like you've got hot desert down in southern Arizona, and then you go up to like high desert in northern Arizona, where it's like it's cold. There's snow on the ground. It's still a desert though.
and so much of the modern province of Xinjiang is the Taklamakan Desert. And the Taklamakan Desert is really important historically. It was one of the very few routes out of China to the rest of the world. It's something we don't think about very often, but for kind of overland routes historically, there's not a lot of overland routes out of China. There's the Himalayas and the broader mountain range system just kind of cuts you off from India. It cuts you off from most of Southeast Asia. Really, your land routes out of China are either through Vietnam, or there's a couple of mountain passes in the west, or of course you can go north through Siberia. But Siberia has kind of always been not great to travel through. And
Yeah.
honestly, it's historically always been better to go through one of these little mountain passes in the West, even though you have to travel through these like famously inhospitable deserts to get to them.
It's
And
the
the
least
Taklam,
worst option.
yeah. um, and I mean, I guess Vietnam is the least worst option, but that gets you in one direction, and if you want to go
But the
west,
the
like Vietnam's not a big
the
help.
the Mughal Empire isn't on the other side of Vietnam though, so you don't, and it's that chain. I mean, this is the Silk Road, right? I mean, this is
Yeah.
what is known to Europeans as the Silk Road, right? Because the Chinese trade with the Mughals, and the Mughals trade with the Persians, and the Persians trade with the Turks, and the Turks trade with the Greeks, and like the whole way across, right?
I will confess, I'm not a huge fan of the term Silk Road because when I was a kid, whenever I would hear this thing, I would always imagine like a road, right? Because it's right, it's 50% of the name is
Well,
road.
and not only silk went on it, so yeah, it's double
Mhm.
wrong, right?
But like it's not a road. It's kind of this network of trading routes that passes through Central Asia, and it's thousands of years old, right? And just as different climate and political changes happen, the primary trade routes just kind of move. But this is the Silk Road goes back literally thousands of years in an environment that looks totally different from how it looked in, say, Marco Polo times,
Sure.
and um and and used a totally different route. And so anyway, that's a total
But am I
irrelevant
wrong?
tangent.
Is this particular area
No,
part of
this,
that?
yeah,
It is
totally,
part of
totally.
that
Yeah.
shifting pattern of trade
Hmm.
routes and stuff like that as different cultures are in control of that whole Western Asia region, that
Yeah.
the route changes and stuff like that. And
Hmm.
this lake is on or part of that route system, right?
Yeah, so the Taklamakan Desert, I'm going to mispronounce. I mean, this whole thing's going to be full of egregious mispronunciations, but the Taklamakan Desert is what's called an endorheic basin, which means water flows into it. It's ringed on three sides by mountains, and those mountains have snowfall and they have snowmelt, and like water runs down into the Taklamakan Desert in creeks, and the creeks join and form rivers. But water doesn't flow out of the Taklamakan Desert. Water goes in, it doesn't come out.
Right.
It just, you have these river systems through the desert, and eventually they just sort of peter out. They never reach the sea. They never leave the desert. And Lop Nor, this wandering lake, is one of, or arguably the primary place that the water winds up. And something you have to understand about endorheic basins is they're very salty because river water has salt in it. It doesn't have very much, but it does have some salt in it. It's passing over rocks, like those rocks contain salt. So if the water is going into the desert and then evaporating, the salt doesn't evaporate. The salt stays behind. So these mountains are just pumping salt into the desert, and the salt stays wherever the water leaves. So what you have is these rivers, and they're forming, and they're also moving. This isn't something we think about very much as modern Americans, but rivers naturally move. And actually, here in America, we devote considerable effort and expense to keeping our rivers from moving. It
Uh-huh.
would be really bad if the Mississippi River just woke up one day and is like, nope, I'm going this way now, right? This bend, which has always gone like this, is now going to go like that.
I mean,
Um,
that's yeah, there's a big structure right there that's funded by the taxpayers to make sure it doesn't do that.
Yeah, because it would be disastrous if this river did what it naturally wants to do. And so rivers are just naturally always changing their courses. And the flatter the terrain, the more they do this, the faster they change their courses. The Taklamakan Desert is generally very flat. So you have these rivers that are constantly changing their courses, which means they're constantly like bumping into each other. And then all of a sudden, where there were two rivers, now they're coming together and they're forming this other river. But then a few years later, like the river will curve a different way, and now it splits, and now it's going to bump into this other river. And so like you have this constantly moving network of how water is flowing through, and eventually it reaches, and eventually it kind of all comes together usually. But where it all comes together isn't always in the same place. Sometimes it's over here, sometimes it's over there, and then it'll form what is essentially amounts to a delta, like where a river meets the sea and it breaks into a bunch of little branching channels. Except it's not meeting the sea. These are what's called distributaries, and then it just, there's a lake, and that's it. There's no rivers or creeks or streams out of the lake. And this lake is called Lop Nor, and Lop Nor had an uncanny habit of moving around, because if all the water used to be directed over here, but now it's being directed over there, well, the lake was over here, but now the lake's over there. And anybody who's worked on deltas will tell you deltas are constantly changing which channel is the main channel. As you know, the main channel fills with silt, and a new channel kind of carves itself a deeper route. So even if the rivers aren't moving, in the where the water's coming out of the delta is constantly changing. So this lake is always moving around. You could also look at it as there's just a whole bunch of different lakes that could, and most of the time they don't exist, and only
Yeah,
one lake exists at a time.
they're seasonal lakes, but
But the
which
seasons are
one gets
measured in
filled,
years.
well, yeah, and which one gets filled in any one season is random based on
Mhm.
this distributary process from the snow melt and all that kind of stuff.
But for most of human history, the Taklamakan Desert has been very lightly settled, with a very important exception that we'll talk about. But it's it's lightly settled, particularly by pastoralist people who don't typically leave much of an impact in the historical record. So the records that have come down to us about this lake always treat it as if it's the same lake. They just keep putting it in different places. So like you'll show up and you'll have this, old manuscript that says the lake is here, and you show up and there is no lake there. And then you travel onwards for, a few days, a few weeks, and you come to the lake and you're like, what the heck? The lake is moved. Like lakes aren't supposed to do this. Um,
Right. I
and
mean, I imagine, I mean, I think you were going to say this at some point, but like you can imagine like administrator of this generation is like, oh, administrator of last generation, last time we came out here, you got it wrong. It's, this many leagues from the last known location, and it's updating
totally.
their chart or whatever.
There was a Russian geographer named Przewalski. I know that's to be a mispronunciation. But if you've ever heard of the Przewalski's horse, he's the same guy.
Ah, I have
But
I have heard of that horse.
it's a cool horse. But so at one point he is mapping Western China, and he has all these old Chinese government documents, right, from different imperial eras. And they're all putting the lakes in different places, and he shows up in the lakes in a place that's not found in any of these records. And like he does exactly what you say. Like he just says, like, these guys don't know anything. And it wouldn't be he's operating in the late 1800s. It wouldn't be for I think another 10 years before somebody's like, what if the lake moves? Anyway, there is kind of one exception to this whole like lake moving around period, lake moving around thing, which is from about 100 BC to about 330 AD. The lake stays in the same place. Um, and it's a salt lake, right? Just like the Great Salt Lake in Utah, just like the Dead Sea. It's a salt lake, but it's staying in the same place, and it's fed by rivers, and the rivers are fresh water. And with access to water, consistent, reliable access, you can have agriculture out here in the Taklamakan Desert. And during this 400-year period, you get a kingdom developing on the shores of Lop Nor, a kingdom called Lulan, and Lulan had a big capital city also called Lulan. Um, and Lulan, for some of this period, became quite wealthy because it controlled one of the biggest trade routes between China and the rest of the world. Um, and then, of course, Lulan falls under the sway of different potentates and powers, including China for some period. I want to say the Xiongnu control Lulan for a period. But like Lulan is a thing for 400 years, and then the lake moves again, and
Yeah.
Lulan just crumbles, right? Like you can't have a settled agriculture dependent kingdom without
Right.
reliable access to water. Like Lulan just disappears. Um, it's worth noting of the people who live here, both in Lulan and not. There are a lot of mummies that come out of this, particularly in the soil is very salty, right? So it lends itself to mummification. But many of the cultures that have lived in the area of Lop Nor have also kind of taken advantage of that and intentionally treated their dead to prepare them for mummification before finding the saltiest places, the saltiest soil to make their cemeteries in. And so we have just a lot of really extraordinary mummies going back, I want to say 5,000 years, something like that.
Wow.
Um, um, and it's really, really cool. Anyway, so kind of some other cool stuff. You've got these mummies, you've got this abandoned, ruined city. You've got this lake that keeps moving around. It's very salty. When Przewalski visits, he reports like, hey, there's an empty city over here, 2 miles in diameter. Wild, huh? He he also he reports that there are people living in the marsh when he visits in 1876. These people are probably Uyghurs, who are the most recent largest ethnic group in Xinjiang. I'm not sure if they actually count as the largest right now because the Chinese government is working very hard to conduct large-scale genocide and replacement of the Uyghurs. Um, but um, but in any case, Przewalski reports that there are people living in the lake, that the lake is kind of a marsh at this point. And people are cutting down reeds in the marsh to lay them on kind of the drier parts of the marsh. There's a stable place that you can stand on and build a hut. Kind of confusing things further, Przewalski reports that at this time, if you go a little bit upriver from the marsh, there's a large freshwater lake. But if the wind blows from like just the right direction, the lake is very shallow and the entire lake just moves, right? Like it just overflows its banks and goes into a different place because the wind has literally like pushed on its surface enough to move the
Right,
great
right.
bulk of the water over.
It's
Um, so you have the lake, the salt lake that wanders in terms of years, and then the freshwater lake that wanders in terms of days. Um,
a
a
dynamic environment. And like yeah.
Yes. Another really cool thing that Przewalski reports from talking to folks in the area, he reports that in 1862, 160 Russians moved onto the shores of Lop Nor, near the ruins of Lulan. And these guys belonged to um, a sect, a religious sect that still exists today in Russia called the Old Believers. These guys
Oh yeah.
are Russian Orthodox, but they are Russian Orthodox who say that they do not like the reforms instituted by Peter the Great. Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, instituted a bunch of religious reforms way back in the day, and the Old Believers are not here for it. And this particular like subsect of the Old Believers were called the Wanderers, and the Wanderers as a subsect do not exist anymore. But they would wander around the fringes of Russia looking for a place called the Uponskoye Kingdom, which some viewers may be familiar with as like a matter of Russian folklore. It's kind of a literal paradise on Earth that by now is just a matter of folklore, but the Wanderers believed that it was like a literal place that you could literally travel to, and they very much wanted to move there and live there.
Is this like the Russia or the Old Believer equivalent of like Prester John and all that sort of stuff?
Kind of. I don't know to what extent like the Oponskoye kingdom is like ruled by a righteous true Christian the way like Prester John's kingdom supposedly was, but like there are definite parallels there. Anyway, after a year living on the shores of this salt lake surrounded by ruins and mummies,
They're like,
they
maybe this
decided
isn't heaven on earth after all.
could be. Who can say? And the local Chinese governor just like gives them some horses so that they can keep moving. Um, so, and there's a couple other major geographic expeditions out in the area of the Taklamakan Desert during the late 1800s, very early 1900s. Um, some of which fall prey to the fact that the lake moves, right? One of these expeditions, led by a Swede named Sven Hedden, um, he hires a local guide, who is like, no, 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 don't worry, I know where all the rivers are, I know where all the lakes and oases are. We'll be able to bounce. Um, and the guide was not particularly useful. Hedden says like, oh, the guy just lied, right? But I think we can't rule out the possibility that the guide's information was accurate for last year.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so basically everybody on the expedition except Hedden and two other people like die of dehydration in the course of the expedition. Um, and
Lovely.
and kind of one final expedition that I'll mention was by in 1906 by a Hungarian British geographer or archaeologist, excuse me, named Arl Stein, who hired guides who like were successfully able to hop in between sources of fresh water. But when he arrives, Lop Nor is very far from Lulan, and Stein is an archaeologist, so he's trying to get to Lulan, but Lulan doesn't have a source of fresh water near it. So what he does is he waits until winter, and when in winter, of course, Lop Nor freezes over, and ice is fresh water, even if it forms on a body of salt water. Ice is fresh water. So Stein is able to carve off great blocks of ice and take them with him as a source of fresh water for his expedition to Lulan. And boy, do I think that's super gameable.
Uh,
Um,
yeah,
and
I
then
mean
like
this is, I mean, we could, you've
what
given us
what
so much already, but
one final little
yeah,
thing
yeah,
I'll mention
sure.
before we talk about the game ability is just FYI, Lop Nor no longer exists. In 72, China put a dam on the Tarim River, the primary river that historically fed Lop Nor, to create a reservoir, um, an agricultural reservoir. China at this time was big into trying to turn the awful wastes of Western China into something productive. The agricultural reservoir thing didn't really work. The dam is still there. Now it's the reservoir is a nature reserve. But as a consequence of the dam, the Tarim River like kind of doesn't exist downstream of the dam
Right.
really
That's
anymore, and Lop Nor just function. Lop Nor does not exist. Now it's a mine. There's a big salt mine out there, digging for I assume lithium. Lithium is the big hotness for salt mining right now for batteries, and there's a
true.
bunch of lithium mines and other metal salt mines out in Xinjiang, and there are also persistent claims that Uyghur slave labor is being used in those mines. I wasn't able to determine whether the Lop Nor mine specifically has been accused, or for that matter, what it produces. Just you look at it on Google Maps and like, yes, that is a salt mine. That is very clearly a salt mine. Like,
Right.
um,
It's I spent some time on the satellite imagery myself, looking at the desert and looking for the ruins and stuff like that. Yeah, it's hard to know what's happening on the ground in certain places in the world, for sure.
but like from a gaming perspective, right? Uh,
Well, I think what's so fascinating about what you've set up about this is just the incredible number of layers. Uh, uh, you've got this ancient kingdom that left a city because it was stable enough to build, I assume, like mud brick kind of situation, or is the stone built buildings? Like
I have been
what is
assuming that it was
Lulan?
stone, but I actually never checked that assumption, so I
Um,
don't know.
either way, I mean, it's not going to go away in the desert. There's probably not enough precipitation for it to like dissolve the mud bricks. So they might not even be fired mud bricks, like whatever. I mean, it's sort of a preserved environment, but then you've got like other people that lived there, Uyghur people who were doing the salt marsh living with the grass mats, and you've got Russians expeditions, and you've got up until what 190 was you said 1906 was one of the other expeditions that was out there doing the archaeology on one of the previous layers, and then you've got salt mining now by the current. people in control of the area, and like it's just layer after layer after layer, and you can kind of
Mummies, don't forget the
oh,
mummies.
right, back to 5,000 years. So you've got like maybe accidental, possibly intentional, like probably some of both, layers all the way back. And so like this is a, like I said, this is in addition to the wandering lake, like the conditions have created this like layered thing, and you can, when you interact with this environment, like in a gameable context, like that's almost like the idea is to like create those kind of layers to your gameable situation, right? Take the inspiration from this thing, and like, I mean, this works in archaeology all the time. I mean, I don't want to talk about like roundhouses underneath 18th century, cellars in the UK very long, but there's that too, right? I mean, there's layers of history, right, exist, and so there's so many disparate layers here in this desert environment. To any one of those layers is what could bring your party there, and then there's all those other layers too. Is a I mean, to over summarize what
Yeah, yeah,
you're kind of
totally.
like presenting as a extremely gameable context. Like this is sort of like, sometimes your posts are like, oh, there's this one cool guy, put him in your game. But then this is like a whole supplement, right? Where there's like
Yeah,
all of
yeah,
these
basically.
layers that are happening, and all these different people have come into this environment in different ways and affected it, not infected it. Um, so anyway, I that's my response to it, and that's why I wanted to talk about it, because it is so interesting. But what are some of the most gameable things that you want to bring out and highlight about it as a
The the thing that really, so first of all, I totally agree with your assessment, right? Like this is a setting, right? This is a place where you can do a lot of things, but I really like focusing on like what specific thing are we gonna do here? This is um I could do a whole rant on people publishing like cool, exciting settings where it's unclear what you actually do there. Like, yeah, it's cool, it's neat, but like when I show up to game night on Saturday, like, what are we gonna do? Right? Are we gonna
right?
um and here I think the like no for realsies, like what brings us here? Like what is the
Sure.
precipitating incident is I really love the idea of hey and obviously you filed the serial numbers off of it. This is, you put this in your fictional setting, but there's this area that an expedition of some sort got sent to because there's these really cool ruins and we want to know more about the ruins, or maybe it's D&D and there's might be magic items in the ruins or whatever, but an expedition got sent there, um and uh and that's the last anybody's heard of them, right? Like no word on what happened to this expedition. Um and it's been a year, it's been 2 years, it's been 3 years maybe, and like we should have heard something by now.
Right.
So hey, player characters, why don't you go out there to the place where the previous expedition disappeared and try not to disappear yourself, but come on
Right.
back and tell us what happened to them. So you go out there and you find everything exactly as described, right? Like there's a big ruined city. It's right on the shores of this lake. The lake is salty as promised, but you've arrived in winter, which means that
Right.
it was a devil and a half to get there. But now that you're here, you've got all the fresh water you could ever want. And, okay, cool. We poke our nose into the ruins. Hey, look, here's the bodies of the previous guys. That's weird. Their bodies are mummified. They all very clearly died of dehydration. They all died of thirst. Well, that doesn't make any sense because look, there's all this water over here and they arrived in winter too. Like, so why did they die of thirst? And of course, the answer is, yeah, man, the lake wasn't here. The lake was someplace else, but the player characters have no way to know that.
Right.
And so now you have to start poking around and interacting with the environment in ways that can provoke opposition and obstacle to figure out like what the hell is going on. So maybe you decide you're gonna push deeper into the ruins. Maybe there's a clue in the ruins, and sure there is. This the same region um, also contains the Mogao caves and the Dunhuang Monastery, which famously contain this like treasure trove of lost scrolls that had been preserved in a sealed up room in the dry desert environment. So like, yeah, man, you can totally find records from this ancient civilization that's like everything was fine until the lake moved and the lake started moving again. And then maybe the player character can go like, oh, that's what happened. But of course, you got to fight mummies, right? If you're going to push deeper into the ruins, you got to fight mummies. Maybe they
Sure.
decide they don't want to do that, right? Maybe they're like, you know what? Maybe there's something weird about the lake, right? Maybe they figured out that the lake water is poison, the lake ice is poison. Maybe we should investigate this lake. So you go down to investigate the lake, and of course, there's like salt monsters down there, right? You got to fight the salt monsters in order to find the critical information, which is, hey, there's a bunch of channels around here, and some of these channels have fresh water on along them, and of those channels, some of them have, live trees growing along them, and some of them don't because they're new channels that haven't had a chance for plant life to get established. And then there are these other dry channels out here in the desert, some of which have dead trees growing along them because it's been a long time since water flowed in them. And kind of that's enough information to be like, oh, there's something weird going on with how the water gets around. But you got to fight the salt elementals. You gotta brave the harshness of the desert climate. And then like a third option is, what if we just ask somebody, right? Like there are people living out here. They're not living in great numbers, but there are totally people living out here, moving their flocks around to follow the water and follow the grass. Um, let's go talk to them. And that then becomes you still have to, brave the winter desert environment, but then you've got the social challenge, right? Where there's a bunch of people who very much prefer that they live an isolated existence with minimal
Right. They
contact. Um,
they didn't walk out here out on accident,
yes. Most of their contacts with outsiders have been bad, so you have to get them to trust you, and that's not easy. And maybe they send you on fetch quests to prove your worth or whatever. But like,
Right.
you because of kind of this layering that you were talking about, there's not just like, okay, you're here, here's what you have to do. Instead, it's you're here, here's a problem. There's a bunch of ways that the player characters could pursue this, and of course, if the setting is portrayed in an interesting, dynamic, complex way, as hopefully you do, then ideally, the players aren't going to do any of those three things. They're going to say, what about X, right? Like you've
Right.
described the situation, we've poked around, we've learned a little bit about it. If they died in this way, then that suggests this other thing. So let's see about confirming this other thing. You're like, oh geez, I didn't even think of that. Sure. And now you're in real fun times, right? Because the players are going off on an adventure of their own, and like that's where the medium really shines.
Sure. Right. I mean, because then, they've either they're bringing in something else about like, and this is where the challenge of like the yes and or whatever, where you're like, look, I've got all this research about like, how salt crystals form in the desert environment and like what precipitates out and like river channels. And they're like, yeah, but what if we do, they don't want to they don't want to set up they don't want to solve the mystery of the missing people. Now they're like, oh, we need to set up a mine ourselves. And like, then you're like, I didn't, or whatever. I mean, it's the challenge of that like dynamic situation, right? Of like, I prepped all this
Totally.
stuff and they're going to do this other stuff with it instead. And that's always, like you say, it's like, sure, let's figure this out together. What is going to happen?
And for me, that's where the medium is at its most fun. Is I prepared something for you to do, because the last thing we want is you guys to show up and say, okay, what's interesting, what can we do? And the GM's just like, oh, I thought you would figure out something interesting to do. Like,
Right.
no, that's not fun. But so you have these things prepared that the players could do. But if when the one of the players says, my character is an oracle, and I think what we really need to do is to commune with the spirit of the land. Like, oh man, so you're gonna ask this, that's really cool. All right, let me, figure out how we're gonna do that. And so you're gonna
Let
ask
me
the
get
spirit of
in
the
the
land.
headspace of a basin that collects salt.
Yes. So you're gonna ask the basin about these dead archaeologists, right? Like, oh no, I don't care about that. That's beside the point. Like, oh, great spirit of the land, where is the lithium? Like, we must return with the valuable lithium. Like, okay, we're going someplace else. Awesome, I'm here for it. And then you're telling a story that's different from anything any one of you could have come up with on their own, and that's
Right,
that's the
right,
joy of the medium.
right. Yeah, I, yeah, the joy of the medium. It is like no other thing, because it is so, or it can be, all of those parts. This we don't need to turn this into like how great is role playing session, but like,
I've heard it's great.
yeah, I enjoy it. I enjoy it every time I get to do it. Almost every time I get to do it. Um, all right, so we've talked for a while about this one. You want another topic? You want to cover another topic more briefly? Um,
Yeah, I'll see what I can do.
I think we can get through this other one that you've proposed a little. There aren't as many layers, I guess,
It's
is to
not as
this
many
one.
moving parts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Uh,
what's the other topic you want to talk about?
so I came prepared to talk about this really interesting phenomenon in England and Wales from 1530 onwards, called the Visitations, which has to do with heraldry. And like it's a super gameable application of heraldry, in my opinion. So some quick definitions.
You don't hear that every day.
uh, Quick definitions: heraldry, like pictures on shields, right? Like coats of
Yeah.
arms and stuff. And This is a an art form that popped up in the early 1100s in England, in northern France, Rhineland, Spain, Tyrol. Um, and it started out as a way for competitors at tournaments to be able to recognize one another and show off, right? So, hey, I'm here, jousting or whatever, and or here in the grand melee, and we're all
Right.
wearing helmets.
Yeah,
So like,
right.
who
When I put my helmet down, you can't see my face, so look for the lion rampant and
exactly, like how's everybody going to know that it's me being the cool dude? Everybody has to know I'm cool. Like, oh right, like I'm the guy with three red diagonal bars on a white background on my shield or whatever.
yeah.
And So kind of by 1200, you've got this kind of firmly established tradition. The grammar of what coats of arms might look like is getting established. It's kind of nailed down by 1250 that, like, look, these are the sorts of things you're allowed to have in your coat of arms. These are the
Mhm.
colors you're allowed to use. Kind of these are the words that are used to describe them so that so that someone can just like write down a series of words in like a kind of neat faux Latin, faux French, that like unambiguously describes your specific coat of arms.
Right, but
Um,
only if you know the code, because I'm
but
sure
only
that's
if you know
all.
the code.
But I'm sure that's
Um,
because I'm sure that's why it's partly wrapped up in that. You can't just call it three diagonal stripes. You have to call it
yeah,
like you have to make it more impressive sounding, I guess, to the
yes.
rubes.
Um, and it Families will typically have like either a family will have like this is our family coat of arms, right? This is what the coat of arms looks like for our family, or they'll have certain pieces of imagery that members of the family use in their coat of arms, but either way, different members of that family will have their own personal arms that look very similar to the family arms. So you can like look at somebody's shield and be like, "Oh, I bet that guy's a Plantagenet," right? Um, and it's called heraldry because for whatever like quirk of history and culture, um, it winds up becoming the province of heralds, and heralds, Heralds, not like the Englishman's name.
Right,
Um, Heralds are um, messengers, they're hype men, they're diplomats, they're people who are in the service of a particular fancy lad who will be like, hey, I'm here to deliver a message from my boss. He
right.
says you stink, or he says, hey, can I marry your daughter? Um, and because they're kind of operating in this interpersonal capacity amongst all these fancy people who have their coats of arms, coats of arms become their thing, right? They are the ones who keep track of what arms everybody's using. Um, and just kind of a neat little tidbit. Heralds see themselves as kind of an international brotherhood. And it at 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt, where English knights and French knights are duking it out. Um, both sides heralds get together and stand off on one side together to keep track of what's going on, particularly who's been killed and who's been captured, because they know everybody's logo, right? So
Yeah.
you can lean over and tell the guy next to you, like, hey, look, that guy got killed. He had, his heraldry looked like this. So that's, Sir so and so. Oh, thank you very much. And then of course you've got people who want to break the rules, because heraldry only works when designs are unique. It's fine if you and your brother have coats of arms that are very similar because you come from the same family. But if you and some earl from like 5 counties over have the exact same design, like, it doesn't work. It's no longer a unique identifier. So heralds are making these roles of who's got what and trying to hash out and keep things unique. I've been focusing here on England and Wales because the kings of England um, start getting personally involved, right? And they start saying, you know what? I, the King of England, am in charge of all heraldry in my domains.
Right. Because
Um,
anything that their subordinates are going to fight about, then they want to be in charge of so that they get to settle all the disputes and keep their kingdom
yes.
from going to civil war about, who can have a yellow bird or
Well, and
whatever.
and it's also, and in
And it's all
addition to,
wrapped into the whole power structure too, of course.
it's wrapped into the whole power structure, and it's a really interesting, like, carrot and stick thing that costs
Mm,
them nothing, because when rulers, particularly in this kind of environment, um need to reward their subordinates, and they need to punish the disloyal. That's how they keep their subordinates doing what they need to be doing. But typically that costs money, right? Like, you only have so much land to hand
right.
out in the form of fiefs. You only have so much money to hand out in gifts. But herald, so you really need to look at forms of gift and punishment that are free, and heraldry is one of them. So if somebody
Right.
some
You now have
some
the honor of building me a ship.
if some knight, right, and just kind of to define our terms, if some heavy cavalryman with pretensions of being important and like socially valuable, if some knight of no standing, of no particular lineage, like, nobody cares about this guy, okay, cool, he's managed to do just enough religious stuff to get a knighthood, and he has just enough money to get himself a nice horse and a suit of armor. Um, but he does something really great for you, the king. You can be like, hey, thank you so much for your help. Have a coat of arms. This one's
Right.
yours. You get it for free. It's you. And now it also becomes your family coat of arms. So your kids get to use variants on it, and so forth and so on. And similarly, if somebody's been a real jerk, right? Like, oh no, he betrayed me. Like, cool, you don't get to use your family coat of arms anymore. Like, you
Right.
don't get one. Your whole family doesn't get one. Your whole family gets stripped of its identity. That cost me nothing. I didn't have to put your castle to siege. I didn't have to burn anything. Like, you just can't use it anymore. So anyway, um, around 1530, but through all this period, English and Welsh knights, nobles, all that stuff, um, aren't all using coats of arms with permission, right? Like, because what's the king gonna do? Like, show up with a bottle of paint thinner and like remove it from your shield?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about like the late 1400s, I mean, like England and Wales is where they were figuring out who was going to be the king anyway. Like that's
Right.
like there's all kinds of loyalty systems that were in competition with each other right in that period. I
Uh,
mean, the Tudors came out of
mhm.
Wales and ended up eventually winning, but like it was under debate for a long time. You're right in that area.
So around 1530, King Henry VIII, that's the guy with all the wives, King Henry VIII says, you know what? There's a lot of people out there in the countryside running around with a coat of arms that hasn't been approved. It hasn't gone through the official channel. And the only way to get people to knock it off is to launch a formal investigation. So he goes to the College of Heralds, and the College of Heralds by this point is like a part of the royal household. And he tells the College of Heralds, listen, I need you all to go out in the countryside and look at everybody's coats of arms. And anybody who's using a coat of arms that they can't prove they have a right to, you need to tell them to knock it off, or else I'm going to come over there.
Right.
Um, and so they go out into the countryside and just start investigating, right? And they'll roll to an inn, and they'll send word to everybody within 7 or 8 miles of that inn who is using a coat of arms or has right to a coat of arms. Hey, come by the inn. Come by the inn, introduce yourself, show me a shield, that's got your coat of arms on it. And we'll hash it out. And I've got my books full of who's related to who. And I will make sure. And of course, this was very profitable because you were an envoy of the king. So when Sir So-and-so shows up, he's bringing you a gift because it would be rude not to bring a gift. Is
Sure.
this a bribe? Sure. But you got to play
No,
the game. And
officially not.
similarly, the heralds are also playing the game. So like, if somebody is sufficiently important, they don't have to travel to the inn. The herald will travel to their house, and make sure everything's copacetic. But these heralds, they're also visiting the local churches, and like checking the windows, because one of the things you would do is you would buy a window in a church and you would include your coat of arms in it, so everyone would know that guy's family, he's very important because he was able to buy a window in the church. And the heralds would be like, I don't recognize that coat of arms in that window. That one's not approved. We need to tear that window out. Um, and so it's this kind of investigation and politics thing. Um, just a couple other kind of examples of things that heralds found while out on the visitations. See here. Graves. They would find
Hmm.
graves that had unauthorized logos on them, and nope, gotta chip that off the grave. That's not approved. Um,
Go ahead, go ahead. But I have thoughts. I have thoughts.
they found that some fancy lads were making up their pedigree. A Sir Edward Deering, who died in 1644, added a bunch of fictional ancestors to like old manuscripts he had in his family
Hmm.
library, so he could have a fancier, more important pedigree. A guy by the name of John Lord Lumley, who died in 1609, legit had a fancy pedigree, but he wanted it to be even fancier. So he dragged in a bunch of like funerary statues. These are typically statues that will like lie on top of a bier or a grave. And he would just like drag in statues from other churches of people that he wasn't related to put in his family crypts. He'd be like, that guy? Yeah, I'm descended from that guy. Um,
Right. Right.
and one kind of particularly egregious example was a guy named Sir Richard Houghton, um, who who only had a coat of arms by virtue of being the lord of a particular castle. The arms were associated with the castle, not with him, and that castle actually belonged to his wife's family. So he kind of married into this coat of arms. But he was a real big jerk, and had imprisoned his wife and was living very openly with a mistress and their children together. And the herald who investigated this is like, I don't think you still get to be using the logo at this point. He wrote down indignantly that Sir Richard didn't even bother to bribe him. Right? Like, yeah, if he'd offered me a big gift, we could have come to an arrangement, but he did. Can you believe this guy? Um, so yeah, like I think this
Uh,
is incredibly gameable.
yeah, first off, before we get to the gameable side, like for one, this sounds extremely Henry VIII, knowing everything else that Henry VIII did, that he would start this process going on. And the other thing that occurs to me is that this is sort of like this is like a consequence in some respects, and this is like sort of broad historical themes or whatever that are sort of beyond the scope of this program. But like this is like post gunpowder and by this you're talking about 1644 1609. This is like after gunpowder is a thing. So like the idea of heavy cavalry running around, like at Agincourt you had like guys on
Mhm.
knights that are like running at each other with melee weapons, but like by the time that this heraldry stuff is happening, you can't prove yourself on in battle in quite the same way. The whole like what makes you a knight is changing, is under flux in that period. And so like
The
all they have
this
left is they're like, oh, but my grandfather was a knight, like you don't get to be a knight in that same way anymore yourself, even if you're still wearing shiny armor and still like showing up for duty as a soldier for the king and stuff like that. It's
and it's
it's
worth
different.
noting that showing up for that a knight's military obligations by 1530 look enormously different, in no small part because um, in earlier centuries, heavy cavalry was unstoppable, right? Like you can have specific situations like the Battle of Agincourt or the Battle of Crécy where like they were counterable, but for the most part, like yeah, a heavy cavalry charge was unstoppable. And by the time period we're talking about, it was counterable, and that fundamentally changed the nature of European warfare. And since the aristocracy of Western Europe was structured around warfare, that necessarily had huge implications for the social structure of fancy important people. And so now military service for a knight didn't reliably take the form of I will show up, I will be in armor, and I will have the appropriate number of horses. It typically, by this point, took the form of here's a bunch of money, use it to hire professional soldiers.
Right, right.
Um, and yeah, so like it's this moment of enormous social flux where just like you said, where the world is changing, and um, but do some things need to stay the same? Says Henry VIII. Are some things not change? Must this heraldry stay the same?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it just some of those things like the stories that you told there about like the guy who brings in the statuary from other crypts and stuff like that to like sort of big up his ancestry, you know, that's that's like the only, it's not the only, but it's like it's sort of like it seems petty because you can't show up in the same, you can't win a joust anymore, right? So you have to kind of fake it by moving statues around. I mean, it's a very, I don't know, it makes total sense to me that this is the age in which this is happening, where this minutia becomes so much more important. Because if you had, I can imagine like still you had falling out of favor, falling out of, whatever, the barons, you go back 300 years, right? And John fought the barons and all that kind of stuff. And so like I'm gonna put a red eagle on my chest, and like you have a problem, come fight me about it, and like that's the relationship that king had with his barons, where like by Henry's time it's sort of like they got to fight over pettier things because like nobody's challenging the Tudors to in that way that they were able to challenge, John or whatever. Anyway, so that's just my own thoughts about this is not really germane to what you're talking about, but like, so how is it gameable, right? Are you looking for like, is it a petty thing? Like, is it a sign of like fallen aristocracy that now they're squabbling over who gets the red badger on the shirt with the red badger versus the shirt with the green eagle? And can you use it that way, or is it, or how would you, what would be the way that you would use it, I guess, you
Well,
know?
the obvious step one is have the PCs be the ones who are going out on the visitations, right? Like,
Ah, okay. So
uh,
they're going to be the ones that are employed to stir up this pot.
exactly, they're the ones who are out there causing trouble, right? Because that's what we want. We want our player characters causing trouble because when they cause trouble, trouble then fights back, and cool. Now we have a session. Now we have an adventure, right?
Yeah.
You have stirred the pot, and now the pot tries to stir you. Um, but one like thing they can get up to that for me I would find really really fun is, okay, we're going out there, and the GM can do a quick little narration like, oh, you found some dudes who are using their coats of arms improperly, and you've told them like, hey, knock it off, and they're like, you are from the king, he has a big army, okay, I'll knock it off. But you get to this one area, and there is a big powerful noble family, and obviously this is not restricted to a medieval Europe style setting, right? Any setting that has powerful families and logos associated with them,
Oh
like, this
yeah, I
works
mean
just fine.
that's
You
almost everyone.
you show up, and there's a very important, very powerful family that is using this coat of arms and a variety of variations on it. And like, from a certain perspective, their use is entirely legitimate. They have been using this coat of arms for centuries, right? You can go to the graveyard and see it on graves hundreds of years old. You can go into the church and see it on these very old windows, or whatever the equivalent is. In a science fiction setting, you can see it on the front of the bank when they built the bank, and like, that's a very old logo that they put up there on the bank. Um,
Right.
so like, this isn't some like weird little upjump thing, but they never did officially get it approved. Like, they have been using it for centuries, but it's not an official use, and they're not in good enough favor with the crown that they can just like wire up the king and be like, "Excuse me, Your Majesty, it's come to my attention. We never actually got the piece of paper." It's like, "Oh, Greg, oh, so great to hear from you, man. Sure, I'll have my guy fax that over to you right away." Um, and so now the player characters are in this situation where, in order to do their jobs, they have to make enemies. um and that's what we want, right? We want the player characters making enemies and making friends, and maybe they decide they don't want to do their job. Maybe they're like, look, maybe we don't want to tangle with these guys are more trouble than they're worth. Have you seen how many mercenaries they keep in their employ on
Right,
any
right,
given
right.
basis? We're only level 1. But okay, cool. You make that decision. Now you've
Or,
made enemies in the College of Heralds.
right, or
Um,
right. I mean, there's a dynamic situation there because like you could end up like being the facilitator, like, oh, look, it's come to our attention that this is the paperwork you never filed, but we will file it for you, like, um, almost trying to extract a favor from
mhm.
I don't know, you got to pick your, like you said, pick your enemies, pick your friends.
And maybe they say, maybe the dudes wind up saying, no, no, we don't see this as you offering us a favor. Like, we don't recognize that the king has any authority over this, my
Right,
great 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 grandmother's logo.
right, right.
Um, and and yeah, so just like you said, it becomes a dynamic situation. And I love a dynamic situation because then it can go any which way. We're off the rails. The players are making they're making enemies, they're making friends. Presumably this powerful family has local enemies. So whichever side the players go with, they anger the other side as well. And what I would use this for personally is, I would use this as the adventure that starts a campaign. Not because I am advocating for, oh, you should do a whole campaign about, the visitation. Like, no, don't do
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
But we have a new campaign, we have a new group of characters. What you need is an adventure that kicks things off, that provides a bunch of NPCs and gets genuine organic relationships, both for good and for ill,
Right.
between those NPCs and the characters, because then they can come up again and again through the rest of the campaign.
Right. It's starting off something small. Like you're fighting about a symbol, which, obviously symbols have a lot of power, but it's like, it's not, you don't start them off with like, here, level ones, go win the siege of this fortress palace, right? Like, start off with like challenging about the symbols on the walls, and then you build up to possibly the siege where, whatever. But like, yeah.
Yeah, and then all the friends you make and the enemies you make can pop up again and again and again throughout the
Right.
campaign.
The
And it
heraldry was the friends we made along the way.
And then it makes the campaign feel real, right? It makes the campaign not feel like, oh, we're just playing, this printed adventure book and this printed adventure book. Like, no, this campaign is different from any other campaign that any other human being has ever played in before, because it's ours, because it's about these characters and their personal relationships. And I'm a big believer in, you want to kick that off as fast as you can, and you want to find the NPCs that the player characters love to hang out with, and you want to find the NPCs that the player characters love to antagonize, and just keep those guys showing up again and again and again. And like, yeah, it makes a really fun campaign.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to wrap this conversation up. Thank you so much, Tristan, for walking me through these blog posts, expanding on them, sort of spitballing some ideas with me. It's been a lot of fun. Tell everybody once again where they can find your content on the internet. If they want to, they want to. I'll put links to these two blog posts, so they've got that. But where else? Where else are you available? And your content is what's out there?
Uh, so you can find me at moltensulfur.com. The link will be in the show notes, where I put out material like this every other week. I also have a number of RPGs and books out there. The most recent one of which is Shanty Hunters, a game about singing and fighting magical sea shanties in 1880. And you can also check out the forthcoming sequel, Ballad Hunters, which has an early access version out for free for $0, where
Nice.
you sing and collect magical folk ballads in 1813 England and Scotland.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Thank you so much again for your time today, for chatting with me about these things. And I think that's we're gonna wrap this up.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. This is always a delight.
All right, and thank you to all of my viewers for having watched this.